guys, and welcome to Mastering V-Ray Lesson 10. If you remember last month, I requested topics from you guys to cover in this lesson, and the overwhelming response I got was to focus the lesson on plant and vegetation shaders as well as architectural shaders. Now, because this lesson ended up taking so long and I've ended up putting more effort into working on the plants than I have on any other lesson, I've decided to split it into two separate lessons. So they're not going to be the same topic, but lesson 11, which was going to be on hair and skin, I've decided to move that to next year and provide that lesson for free because I didn't want to change a lesson out on the V-Ray course and then have people disappointed that they weren't going to be able to see it. So realistically, I've done that just because I didn't think I'd have enough time to cover that lesson and the finale in December. Because my fight's coming up in a week's time, this will be the last lesson I get out before then, and then I'll take some time off to work on that architectural shaders lesson and the finale for the end of the year. So just before we get started, firstly, I want to give a huge thank you to VisPark for providing the grass and plant models for this lesson. The lesson wouldn't have been possible without them, and the quality wouldn't have been as good had I gone in and tried to use some of my own models that I've used in the past, or simply gone and bought some of my own models that I wasn't able to share. So a massive thank you to those guys because they've allowed me to hand select a couple of models to include in this lesson. Now, I would recommend, and I'll explain this later in the lesson, that the more variation you have within your plant models and the distribution of your models, the more likely you are to get a realistic result. So I've hand selected 3 different tree models and only one type of tree to include in this lesson. And you can see here, let me just close this. You can see here that I've chosen 3 pretty different models. One model relies on alpha maps for the leaves, the other is purely geometry, and lastly, we've got a model with some flowers, just for a bit of variation. Later on in the lesson, when I cover the grass setup and distribution, I'll show you the models I provided for that as well. So, when working with vegetation, one of the hardest things I found to acquire is consistency with your results. And what I mean by that is being able to change your camera angle and change your lighting and still having a realistic result without things breaking or things looking unbalanced. The reason it's so difficult to achieve that is because when working with plants, there are a lot of features that need to be considered to match the real world. You've got things like the geometry detail, the texture color and randomization, the reflection amount, the reflection color, the reflection glossiness, bump mapping, the distribution of the models, and even the light intensity. The list can just go on and on, but if one of these things is inaccurate, you're going to be extremely frustrated because, like I was saying, it might look good from one angle and terrible from another. So in order to minimize these issues, I'm going to go through and explain, just like I did on the previous lessons on materials, the different features that make up the plant and the scene itself, working from the most important to the smaller details like the bump mapping and things like the chromatic aberration in the camera. So it's important to realize that even though this lesson's primary focus is breaking down and explaining the V-Ray 2 Cider material, I have gone in and used Forest Pack to scatter and distribute the models. If you don't know what Forest Pack is, it's a scattering plugin for 3ds Max that gives you complete control over scattering instances of your objects however and wherever you want. The reason I'm using Forest Pack is because within the plugin there's kind of extra bonuses like this forest color texture, which lets you go in and adjust and tint the elements within your models, or the leaves for example, using gradients or textures that you hand choose. So if you decided to use multiscatter, I know that it does have pretty similar functionality, but I do apologize because if you are using Maya or a different software that doesn't have Forest Pack, then some of the features in this lesson might not be reproducible. But I will do my best to explain the overall theory behind it so that if you do have similar functionality, you can go in and make sure that those elements that make up the scene are included in your own projects. So the first scene we're going to be creating is this one here. you can see that the type of scene is pretty mainstream. It's just standard middle of the day lighting with a sunny overcast with no clouds. So if we go into this scene, you'll notice here that I've just got a simple green ground plane, and the 3 models that I've selected from VisPark to include in the lesson have just been randomly scattered. You can see if I go into the forest plugin, what I've got is I've got a spline defining where I want the plants, and the reason I've just made it this shape is so that we get a little bit of a kind of arc in lighting, so that some parts are going to be more in shadow and other parts are going to be more in light. And in order to do that, you can just go in here, and if you go into the areas map of the forest plugin, sorry, let me just close that, you can just define a line, which I've done here. You can see. Within the actual scattering, there's a couple of variations to the scale. So if I go down to the scale here, you can see that within ForestPack, it gives you control over that. So I've got some plants that are much smaller than others, and that just helps with the realism. The rotation of the plants is set up, and that's just a default value. But within ForestPack, you've got kind of control over pretty much every which way you want to move those. And then lastly, we've got variation in the material, which I'll get into a little bit later. But to start with, before you can scatter any objects, you need to bring the models in to work with first. Now, when I was working with the VisPark trees, I did need to go in and select the leaves and detach them to make them higher res. So I'm going to merge in a model and just show you what I've done there. However, included in the VisPark collections are the original GrowFX versions of those trees, which does let you go in and define the level of detail. So if you do have GrowFX available also, you do have complete control over that, and it also lets you add animation to the trees. So I'm just going to bring in a model from VisPark, how you will personally see it. You've got this Aliana tree, so I'm going to bring that in, and you can see that when you do it, you've got 4 different variations to bring in. But when I first brought it in, you'll notice that the level of detail on the leaves isn't that great. And you can see here that what happens is on the specular highlights, you end up with a little bit of banding, as well as being able to see in the close-up shots the low-res detail of the leaves. So in order to fix that, rather than going in and using an alpha map on the leaves, because even though that would fix the outer edge, it wouldn't fix the overall smoothing on the surface of the leaf itself. And what that did is when I was doing close-up tests, it was very obviously CG, because you could literally see the bending of the leaves, the low poly bending. So in order to fix that, what you have to do is you have to detach the specific leaves and add a turbo smooth to them, and then reattach them to the tree. So if I go into the element mode for this particular tree, if I go to the sub ID of 4 and detach those, you can see it's selected just the leaves. Now I can go in and add a turbo smooth to that. And what that will do is it just adds a little bit more nice smoothing on the leaf. So if I go to this leaf here, you can see the difference is pretty massive. The shape of the reflection becomes a little bit more rounded. Technically, I could go even higher to further fix that, but then we're getting quite high res on the leaves. However, if your sole purpose is to render close-ups, I'd definitely say go this high, because you do notice it. It does make a pretty big difference. But in this particular scene, I only ended up using 1 iteration on the turbo smooth. So from there, you just select the tree trunk again and attach that back. Now everything's the exact same as it was, but you've got higher res leaves. So the first thing I'm going to explain is how I set up the lighting in this scene. I did go through quite a few variations on the lighting in order to test out what was possible with the V-Ray two-sided shader, but as usual, I've ended up sitting on the simplest solution I could find. So what we've got in this scene here is we've got a V-Ray light, a V-Ray dome light for the GI and reflection. And you can see if I go in and drag the texture there, we've got this very simple handmade HDR that I've just built from stealing a couple of different HDRs and slapping them together. If I bring up the HDR in Photoshop, you can see what we've got here is just a pretty simple blue gradient, which is identical the whole way around, with a slightly brighter top to the HDRI, just to provide a little bit more light from above. And the ground is just a stretched HDR. The only reason I've got that color, I've got it so low res there, is just so that if you don't have an infinite ground plane in your scene, you are bouncing up some green light that would be similar to the level of intensity you'd find on like a grass floor. Now, to coincide with that V-Ray light, for the direct lighting in this scene, I've chosen to use a target directional light, and that just comes down to I've probably used that more than the V-Ray sunlight throughout my career, but technically there's not really much difference in terms of what we're trying to achieve in this particular scene. You can see I've got the intensity of the direct light set to 45, and that's slightly darker than what the V-Ray sunlight will produce, but I found that even though the V-Ray sunlight's a physical model, that having a bit of user control over the direct light made a little bit more sense to me at least. So let me just run through, I'll show you how it looks with the direct light, and then I'll show you how it looks like with the sunlight, and you can see that there's really not much difference. I guess you could say that I prefer to work with the shadows in the direct light as opposed to adjusting the size in the V-Ray sunlight. It just, to me anyway, it just makes a little bit more sense. So let me just get this up here. So you can see on the left part, I've just rendered that with the direct light. Now I'm just going to turn that off and enable the sunlight and render it again. Now, as you can see, pretty much the only difference is just the intensity and the color. The direct light I've got is a little bit more red, and the sunlight by default comes out a little bit too bright. At least that's what I found in my opinion. Now, even though it's based on a physical model, once again, it just comes down to personal preference. So the first and most obvious thing we're going to set up within the V-Ray two-sided shader is the front and diffuse textures. In most cases, leaves will appear completely different on both sides. So the front side of the leaves are usually a lot more reflective and glossy, and the back sides are less reflective and more blurry. If you take a really close look at the leaves, you'll notice that's because of some tiny microfibers covering the backside, which can often give the material a dusty appearance. So in order to take the guesswork out of what diffuse values to use, and I know a lot of the times when trying to match real-world materials, the main component is getting that intensity right, the easiest way we can do that is look at a tutorial that was created by Vlado himself. And at first I was taking the tutorial quite literally and using identical values, but the results I was getting weren't that photoreal. So the most important thing to take away from that tutorial is that the backside is a lot brighter than the front side, and in order to achieve that, I'm going to use two separate diffuse textures that have been adjusted in Photoshop. But first, I just want to show you that tutorial because it gives some really good examples of what's happening with leaves. So without taking the tutorial too literally, in the first image you can see that the front side of the leaf is a lot more reflective and darker, and the back side of the leaf is less reflective and a lot brighter. He then goes through to show you how to calculate the actual diffuse value by dividing the color of the leaf with the paper, which he says here cancels out the environment lighting and the camera white balance. Here you can see the shader set up with the dark back color on the V-Ray two-sided material and the brighter back-sided material. The next thing he goes through to explain is the material reflectivity. So once again, you can see that the front side of the material is pretty reflective and the back side is a lot less reflective. So he goes through and roughly matches the reflection value from the front and back. Lastly, once he's done that, he goes back and makes sure that while rendering the front, the amount of light coming through the back produces a similar result to what he's got in the photo here. But like I said, the results aren't extremely photoreal because you can still see there's quite a little a bit of an inaccuracy there in terms of the reflection color he's got and the reflection glossiness he's got. But in the examples, you can see that the result is pretty similar to what we're trying to achieve here. So let's go into Max, and I'll just run through how to set up the shader for this tree. So the first thing I've done is I've gone into the Forest Pack distribution and I've turned off the flowers and the brighter tree. You can do that by going into the probability, just by selecting in the geometry which tree you want, and if you just change that probability, it'll just add that percentage of trees into the scatter. But because we haven't set up shaders for anything, I'm just going to utilize the same tree. So if we cut from the camera angle, the first thing you can see is we've got a multi-sub-object material here. You've got the trunk as a V-Ray material and the branches. Don't worry about it wigging out, that's just a little bit of a 3ds Max bug. But you can see the bark material. It's not as important as the leaf material, but it's pretty simple. It's just a V-Ray material with a bump map. But for the leaves, the important part, I've gone in, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a V-Ray two-sided material. And on the front side, I'm going to put a V-Ray material. And on the back side, I'm going to turn this on also. And I'm going to put a V-Ray material in here also. So if we look at the tutorial from Vlado and go back up to the top, you can see that the front side color is extremely dark. It's not perfectly black, and the back side's quite bright. So I'll run through what I started with in the scene and how I slowly refined things. But first, what I want to do is because I know it's not going to look realistic without any variation in the shader, I'm going to apply a forest color to that. And the way the forest color texture works is most of the time you're going to want to enable a couple of different textures, and just like the probability with the trees, you can set the probability for the texture applied. You can also set the texture to element or item. If you set the texture to element, it's going to assign different textures here based on the whole object. So say if you set a bright red leaf and a bright green leaf here, if you had it set to item, some trees are going to have the bright green applied and others are going to have the green texture applied. Whereas if you set it to element, it's going to apply random textures based on the individual element on the object. So that would be the leaves themselves. But before I enable these secondary maps, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to apply a V-Ray color before we go in and add any textures, and I'm going to apply that to the diffuse slot at the start. I'm also going to apply it to the back side inside of a forest color. So at the front side, I'm just going to apply a really dark green with a bit of yellow tint to it. And on the back side, I'm going to do the same, except slightly brighter. Now for the translucency, if we go back into the tutorial from Vlado, you can see here that it's kind of a mid-grey value that he's ended up with. So that's where I started with also. I just started with a simple grey, just maybe a little bit darker. So we'll set that to 100. And I'm just going to do a test render. I've reduced the settings quite a lot here, so the things render a little bit quickly. But I'll explain the render settings later once we've adjusted all the shader settings. So as a first test, it's looking okay, but there's not any variation within the leaves themselves. So I'm just going to go into the front side, and rather than using the top color here, I'm going to show you how this was working. We're going to introduce that same color into both slots, and then I'm just going to change the secondary color to be a little bit more red. So this will represent the kind of dying leaves. And because those aren't going to happen very often in the plant, I'm going to change that value to 5. And then I'm going to do the same in the backside as well. And just change that to a slightly brighter red or brown. Okay, if I just re-render again, I'm just going to render a slightly different region. So I've noticed while rendering that I've incorrectly set up the backside of the material. If I go into the diffuse value, you can see, remember when I was talking about setting it to element and item, what I've done is I've kept that at item, and it's putting in that red color into the entire tree. I've also forgotten to change that value to 5. So I'm going to swap that to 5 and set this to element and then re-render, and that should fix things so that the red leaves only show up as on 5% of the leaves instead of the whole tree, which you can see is happening here. So now you can see that's fixed things, and the red leaves are only showing up 5% of the time. So now that we've got the two diffuse values set up correctly, we need to apply some tinting to the leaves themselves so that we get that natural variation that we see in the real world. So what I'm going to do is in the front materials diffuse slot, I'm going to turn on the tint override, and you can see here we've got a bunch of different options. You've got a tint strength from 0 to 100%. You can apply that to 100% through the entire material. But for leaves, I found that setting it between 50 to 75% gave enough variation, but not so much variation where it kind of looked like a fluoro array of colors, which some of you guys pointed out in the earlier work in progress as I was posting. The next option that I'm going to slide is the variation. And you can see if I set it from item to element, what this thing is explaining is it's saying if you've got the variation set to item, it's going to change and tint the color of the entire plant and not the individual leaves themselves. So from plant to plant, you'll get some massive variations. I found that the most realistic results were setting it between, the last 2 and 3 points, because we still want variation among the plant, the whole plant itself, but most of that variation we want happening within the leaves. So I'm just going to set it to the third last point here. We're going to leave the blending mode to color, and these are just the same blending modes you'll get in Photoshop. So if I just quickly go here, if that was our basic leaf material and I wanted to tint it with this color, you can see here, if I set it to color, that's the effect it's having in the Forest Pack texture. So the next thing we need to do is we need to load a texture map that's going to define those values that are being randomized. You can use get color from gradient, and for some more simple projects it's probably going to be enough, but I found with plants that I was getting much better results loading an actual texture map that had some real world values in it. So I'm just going to click get color from map, and I'm going to load this texture I created here, and you can see it's just going to sample from each pixel just some of these values. So I'm going to load that, and that's all set up. So now we just need to do the same for the back. Just going to turn that on, set the same values up. And this time we're going to load a slightly brighter version of this map. I've just blurred it and painted in a couple of textures myself. So you can see there that it's just going to randomly sample from each pixel. Okay, so now we can check out how that's looking. And I'm just going to do another region render, but keeping some of the top so we can see the change. So as that's rendering, you can see the massive impact that tint settings had on the scene. If I go to the diffuse value, up the top was the old setup, and down the bottom is the new setup, and it's a lot more realistic and accurate to what's happening in the real world. So the best part about all this is once you do set this up, the override sliders make a massive difference to the settings, and I just played with these until I got a kind of value that was working, because I did try early on setting those values to 100% and it just created too much randomization. So that's another thing you have to avoid. If you try and force this issue too much, then you're going to be left with an image that just looks like you're trying to reproduce reality instead of just actually doing it. So at this point, we've set the randomization up correctly, but there isn't actual textures being applied to the leaves themselves. We're still just relying on raw colors. So if I go into Photoshop, you can see I've got 4 variations of the same leaf material. We've got the front and back side of the green leaves and the front and back side for the red leaves. Now, I've just taken a texture that was provided by VisPark and done some color adjustments until I've gotten a result that was pretty realistic. I did a lot of trial and erroring with different colors, going darker on the front and back, but what I found is that if you stick to kind of similar values to this, and if I just do an average blur on these images, you kind of get a rough idea of the colors used. But these were the general tones, and you can see they're quite realistic, and in Australia leaves are generally less fluoro green and tropical and a little bit more dull and yellow. So that will change depending on where you're at, but I'd probably stick to similar vibrance values. So if I just sample this color here, you can see on the red, green and blue we've got 72, 80 and 3, and I just stick to something around that, and you can see it is ending up looking similar to the tones we've got here on the render. So what I'm going to do is on the front V-Ray color, I'm just going to apply the front green material, and then you can see here on the red leaf that's scattered, we're going to load the front color for that also. And I'm just going to do the same for the back side. And now we can do a re-render. So you can see that just gives the leaves a little bit more richness as opposed to using simple colors on the left here. If I go to the diffuse filter, you can see once again that now we've got some variation within the whole tree itself, but also within the leaves. So I've toned that back a little bit down from some of the earlier whips I posted for you guys, because I kind of agreed the variation was too strong between each leaf. So that pretty much covers how to set up the diffuse values for the leaf. If you're going to work with a brighter plant, and I'll show you that once I add that other plant in, then you will need to change the values of the leaves, but it's not actually that hard to go in and make shaders for different plants once you've done the work on a single plant and gotten that looking good. So the next step is setting up the reflection. So once again, before I go in and add a texture to these slots, I'm just going to work with some raw colors. And because leaves are much smaller and much less detailed, I don't need to use a custom reflectance curve with them. Another thing is that what I found with leaf materials is that when you're working with them, it's not the same as working with a metal or a plastic. The laws that are kind of governing how they reflect light seem to be a little bit differently, and I think that's because they are such a thin material and light reacts to them in a much different way. On top of that, they're absorbing a lot more light as part of the biological structure of the material. They just naturally absorb more light. So rather than using a custom reflectance curve like we're used to, I'm just going to set the color to be a kind of blue color, maybe not 100% reflective, just kind of somewhere around there, maybe a little bit brighter. I might need to adjust that. And for the Fresnel reflections, I'm just going to go a little bit stronger than usual and maybe set the front side to be 2.4. As you know, the higher we go on that, the more reflective the material will be. So I found 2.4 was a pretty good starting point. For the reflection glossiness, the front side is going to be more glossy than the back side. So we'll start out with maybe 0.6 for the front side. Actually, I'll go 0.7. Now it is optional, I will add this in a second, but you can put a fall-off map into the reflection glossiness, and I'll also answer a question that some of you have constantly been asking me also. So I'm just going to steal that color from the front side and then go to the back side and just paste that in. Sorry. And I'm just going to make it a little bit darker on the back side, and for the reflection glossiness I'm going to go down to 0.5. On the Fresnel IOR for the back side, I'm going to set it to 2. And now we'll just see what happens when we render this out. So I can immediately notice while that's rendering, we've got too much color and too much reflection happening. The leaves are kind of shining almost like a mirror instead of kind of being dulled like what you see in reality. I'll just bring up a reference image for you to show you. So if you take a look at our reference image, I've taken this one out the back of my place, and you can see that we've got a couple of things going wrong. The first thing is that we don't have a fall-off map in the reflection glossiness slot, because you can see here that from front on the material doesn't look very reflective and it looks quite blurred, but from certain angles that are further away from us we get more reflection coming up and a more shiny reflection coming up. So they do behave similar to plastics and the other materials we've set up in the past, except this time they're just a little bit more blurry and the curve is slightly different. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the front side of the material and I'm going to drop some of the color out of that reflection and just darken that off a little bit. And then in the reflection glossiness, I'm going to put a fall-off map. So this was one question that's been asked to me tons, and that is, why did we used to set up materials with 3 layers as opposed to putting a fall-off map in the reflection glossiness? And the answer is, technically you can do both, but applying a fall-off map into the reflection glossiness isn't the same as layering 3 different materials and then blending them. The difference is that when you have one single material and a fall-off map in the reflection glossiness, you don't have reflection values overlapping. So it won't give you that very obvious car paint appearance where from the same angle you're getting a totally different spread of reflection. But for smaller detailed objects and when you don't need to render them up close, like I was usually doing in print, there's absolutely no problem putting a fall-off map into the glossiness. So what I'm going to do is, you can see here that if I just drop this and bring this, sorry, let me just darken this diffuse value a bit so you can see. I'm just applying some green values here so you can see the reflection a little bit more clearly. Okay, so now on the reflection glossiness, you can see that from the front facing angles it's more blurry and near the edge it goes more reflective. But with trees, we have to remember that it's still not going to be totally like a mirror surface because the surface does have such an irregular shape to it. So we need to drop that back a little bit. I'm going to set this to 210, and on the front side I'm going to go to 155. On the back of the material, I'm also going to put a fall-off map, this time going darker to 190 on the edge and 125 on the facing. And that's just as a starting point. I'm also going to drop the saturation and reduce the reflection on the back. And just re-render this. Now, one thing we don't have is maps applied to these slots, which will be the next step. So I'm just going to cancel this render because once again I can see that the reflection's still a little bit too strong. On the back side I'm going to reduce that Fresnel IOR to 1.6, and on the front side I'm going to drop it to 2. I'm still going to drop back the saturation a little bit and just go darker on that color also. On the reflection glossiness, on the edge I'm going to drop that again a little bit more to 195, and on the facing I'm just going to drop it to 140. On the back I'm going to drop the reflection color to be a little less saturated, and once again I'm just going to drop that down to say 100 and 170. So things are starting to look a lot better, but we're still probably a little bit too reflective, and we haven't added the reflection glossiness map, so it's not going to be giving us that nice detailed look. So I'm just going to go in on the front side, and in the reflection glossiness I'm going to turn this into a composite map and keep the old submaterial. I'm going to add a second layer to it, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a texture I've created in Photoshop from the normal leaf by just desaturating it and then going to the levels and adjusting those until it kind of looks like that. So now when I load this map and put it as a multiply over the top, I can kind of define how much I'm affecting the overall reflection. I'm just going to make one quick adjustment to this. I'm just going to go a little bit brighter. I'm going to set this to 50% strength. That might be a little bit too much, but I'll just have to trial and error that. Same for the back. I'm just going to put a composite in. And set it to multiply. And this time I'm just going to do a full render of the whole thing, just so that we're not getting confused with some of the older renders that are happening. And even though I've already gone in and built these scenes, this is exactly how I was going through the process. I was just kind of one by one, just working the different features of the leaves in and refining them as I went. So you can see now we've totally changed the way the material's looking, and in some ways it looks a little bit more realistic, and in other ways the leaves look a lot too similar and there's overall too much light bouncing off them from all angles. So what I'm going to do to fix that is firstly I'm going to go in and apply a texture map to the reflection, and you can see I've got one here which is of a similar color, but as usual if I just preview this, it's going to give us a little bit more variation in the leaf. Secondly, on the reflection glossiness, I'm going to go down into the fall off, and I'm just going to raise it on the edge and on the front just a little bit. Now I'm going to increase the multiply. On the back, I'm just going to drop that to 50, and once again, just raise that up just a little bit to 200. For the Fresnel IOR, I'm going to go up a little bit again. And I'll just compare these two and just do another render. So you can see rendering, we're a little bit closer now, a little bit more realistic, but once again, I'm probably still a little too blurry with the reflections. So on the top face, I'm happy with the back face. I'm just going to go into the front face in the reflection glossiness, raise the edge reflection to 240, and then I'm going to adjust the output so we're not blending linearly. I'm just going to go a little bit higher on the front facing. I'm just eyeballing things. I'm just kind of roughly trying to get the front reflecting and then the edge reflecting a little bit more. And I'll do another little region render and see how it's looking. And just kind of, I could have just gone in and shown you just the final settings to use, but I kind of want to show you the theory behind adjusting these things one by one. So I'm still not completely happy, so I'm going to go into the reflection glossiness once more. Just kind of raise these curves a little bit. I'm just going to reduce it. Every time I go up on the glossiness, I'm just making sure to make sure that there's not too much reflection. Because when you do that, you can see already that there's areas that are blowing out above white. And if I go in and make the glossiness even higher, those points are going to be even brighter. So just to balance that, I'm dropping the reflection amount also. So I'm going to do another render, a little bit higher res and with a bit more anti-aliasing, because it's pretty hard to tell how things are looking when they're a little bit low res like this. Now, it is also important to realize that at the moment, we're only scattering the same tree over and over. So that's why things are looking pretty repetitive. So that will need to be fixed later too. So I'm going to double the resolution I'm rendering this at. And just up the anti-aliasing. So the render took 10 minutes at 2200 pixels wide, which isn't too bad in my opinion. If I just quickly go to the sample rate pass, you can see that we're mostly using anti-aliasing to clean this scene, but I'll explain those settings a little bit later. But basically, I could sit here tweaking the colors of the leaves now for a while and refine those values in. But one thing that the leaves are missing at the moment is bump mapping. And because we've got a reflection map in and a reflection glossiness map in, we are getting some detail in the leaves, which is great, but we do need that extra little bit of detail that comes from a normal map. So if I go to the reference images here, you can definitely see that there's a kind of overall wobble to the surface. And even though we don't have that in our leaves, we can kind of simulate that. So what I'm going to do is, and what I usually use to create normal maps from textures, is a software called Knald. It's recently just come out of beta. So I'm just going to load that. This particular version I was having issues with. So let me just load up the texture. So I'm just going to go into the VisPark collection and load the texture here. And you can see that what it does is it just creates a normal map for us, similar to Crazy Bump. I can go in and adjust some of these settings. Usually I like to reduce the fine and extra fine details because they don't show up that well anyway. I'm just going to maximize the large details. And because this version, I know I've just got to update it, but I'm just going to screenshot that and then use this as a normal map on our leaves. And I'm going to reduce the size of this to 256 pixels. In order to apply the bump, I'm going to load up a V-Ray normal map. So I'm just going to go down here and load that texture. And I'm also going to go into that map and reduce the filtering on it. With things like the diffuse map, I don't like to turn off the filtering on leaves, because I'll explain later in the lesson we're trying to make the work for the engine easier. So by blurring that map, we're reducing the contrast in the pixels and it makes less work for the AA. But for now, I'm going to set the bump value to 40 and just copy that map. And I'm going to apply it to the back as well. And set that to 20. And I'm just going to do a region render here to see if we can start to see the difference in that. And hopefully we get a result that looks kind of similar to this. So from taking a look at the high res, it's pretty hard to notice the bump mapping at this resolution and with these quality settings. So a lot of the time I noticed that while I was working with them, the bump mapping didn't show up until I was rendering really closely. They were also getting hit from the correct angle, so the bump map was kind of hitting at that most ideal angle where it's... I noticed with normal maps, if you have it from two side on, V-Ray just doesn't make it look bumped at all. It still just appears flat. But in order to fix that, there is one thing we can do, and that's going into Knald, and I can change the intensity of the normal map. I'm just going to change that and we'll just try this. So now that I've swapped that texture out, you can see if I go in here